The tunnel still carries a river. The men who built it came home white with dust, then struggled for every breath. One mother washed the thick dust from her family's clothes, then lost 3 sons who had entered Gauley Mountain. A company tally listed 109 deaths. Congress cited 476. Later estimates rose higher. How could a tunnel still producing power kill hundreds, then let their names and final number fade from memory? The answer begins with men emerging white, a warning letter, and graves moved long after the drilling stopped. Before this ends, 3 conflicting totals will reveal how an industrial triumph kept its human cost uncertain. Near Gauley Bridge, the New River still enters a 3-mile passage cut through West Virginia's Gauley Mountain. No explosion marked the Hawk's Nest disaster, because its workers began dying after their final shifts had ended. The delay hid cause from consequence, as scarred lungs worsened far from the white dust inside Gauley Mountain. Today, Hawk's Nest resembles ordinary infrastructure, not a place connected to hundreds of premature worker deaths. Follow 3 places: Alloy's furnaces, the White Tunnel, and the congressional room where workers finally testified. Each place holds one part of the chain, from corporate power to lethal exposure, and a death count still disputed. The chain begins at Alloy, where Union Carbide needed electricity powerful enough for metallurgical production. Union Carbide created the New Kanawha Power Company to develop hydroelectric power deep inside Gauley Mountain. New Kanawha then hired Reinhardt and Dennis, the contractor responsible for driving the tunnel through solid rock. The design diverted New River water through the mountain, using the drop to turn generators farther downstream. That electricity was intended for Union Carbide's electrometallurgical operations at nearby Alloy, West Virginia. Construction began in 1930, as the Great Depression erased steady jobs across Appalachia and the South. For men facing depression unemployment there, a Hawk's Nest paycheck looked like stability, not a sentence of dust. Almost 5,000 men joined the wider Hawk's Nest project, making it an enormous enterprise for West Virginia. Corporate control and physical excavation were separated between Union Carbide's entity and its hired contractor. Hawk's Nest was licensed as civil engineering, a classification that would later carry a devastating consequence. Before that loophole mattered, nearly 3,000 men had to enter Gauley Mountain and face the drilling itself. Most Hawk's Nest laborers were migrants, and many had traveled from the American South searching for paid work. The National Park Service states that at least 2/3 of the Hawk's Nest workers were African American men. With depression job lines long, a sick laborer could leave and another man could be sent toward the same heading. Records count 2,982 men who worked underground, drilling and blasting the rock. Only 4 of every 10 underground workers stayed beyond 2 months at Hawk's Nest, evidence of relentless turnover. After 6 months, only 1 worker in 5 remained, scattering future illness across the men who had departed. That turnover mattered when a man left West Virginia sick before any doctor connected his lungs to Hawk's Nest. The mother from the opening was identified before Congress as Mrs. Charles Jones, and her basin still waits ahead. Before her evidence emerged, crews entered headings where drills, dynamite, rail cars, and rock shared the dark. Congressional testimony described 10-hour shifts, letting workers inhale dust through every underground task. Men accepted those shifts because depression unemployment made the promise of steady wages difficult to refuse. The paycheck explained why men entered Gauley Mountain, but the stone inside determined what happened to their lungs. The next question was already buried in the stone. What exactly turned ordinary drilling into a mass casualty event? Core samples taken before excavation showed that much of the route crossed sandstone with exceptionally high silica. Silicosis was already recognized among hard rock miners and granite workers before Hawk's Nest construction began. Crystalline silica becomes dangerous when drills shatter rock containing quartz into particles small enough to inhale. The project did more than cross the valuable stone, because roughly 1/3 of the tunnel was enlarged to remove it. Ground silica from the excavation could be used by the metallurgical operation that the tunnel was built to power. Yet Hawks Nest remained legally a civil engineering project, not a mine governed by West Virginia's mining rules. That classification excluded its workers from even the limited mine safety enforcement available in West Virginia. The civil label changed which rules reached Hawks Nest, not what silica dust did once a worker inhaled it underground. Crews drilled and blasted sandstone rich in silica inside confined headings with poor ventilation and heavy dust. Each drill released another cloud of mineral particles that could remain suspended where hundreds of men were breathing. Wet methods could suppress airborne dust, but testimony described crews continuing to drill holes without enough water. A mine official's letter in May 1931 warned that respirators were needed against dangerous silica dust. If both dust control and respiratory protection were possible, why did the white cloud continue filling the tunnel? Dry drilling moved faster, and workers testified that production continued while dust accumulated around the headings. Poor ventilation trapped the particles, turning an industrial process into concentrated exposure beneath the mountain. The National Park Service describes the tunnel interior as a white cloud that impaired vision and coated the workers. What comes next is the part no one shows. Crews reportedly changed drilling methods when inspectors approached. Congressional testimony said designated lookouts warned foremen, allowing dry drilling to stop before an inspection. Other testimony placed visibility inside dusty headings at only 10 to 15 feet, despite the installed lights. Raymond Johnson testified that men used compressed air on their clothing or came out of the tunnel completely white. A worker told Congress that dust settled on his drinking water, so he carried milk into the tunnel instead each day. Limited respiratory protection meant ordinary breathing became the pathway carrying crystalline silica into the lungs. Witnesses said supervisors prioritized faster dry drilling, while company representatives disputed the reported dust. Every drilled hole created new exposure, and every blast spread fractured silica through the confined underground air. The immediate scene looked like fog, but the lasting damage began where no worker could see it, deep inside the chest. The white cloud did not stay on clothing. Its smallest particles followed every breath into the deepest lung tissue. Respirable silica particles travel deep into the lungs, reaching tissue that cannot simply cough the mineral back out. The body reacts around those trapped particles by producing scar tissue, a process medically described as fibrosis. As fibrosis advances, lung tissue stiffens and loses flexibility, making each ordinary breath increasingly difficult. Hawks Nest involved acute silicosis, distinguished from the slower disease associated with decades of lighter exposure. Federal health guidance says acute symptoms can appear within weeks to 5 years after extremely heavy silica exposure. At Gauley Mountain, some laborers became seriously ill within months, reflecting extraordinary concentrations of dust. Severe breathlessness could end a worker's employment before the full diagnosis or eventual death entered any record. Silicosis had no cure, so leaving Hawks Nest ended the exposure, but could not reverse scarring already inside the lungs. The disease could keep progressing after men returned south, separating their deaths from the West Virginia worksite. That distance complicated diagnosis because pneumonia and other lung conditions could resemble the final symptoms. Federal guidance confirms that acute silicosis patients may be incorrectly diagnosed with pneumonia or pulmonary edema. At Hawks Nest, congressional testimony said some company doctors used the invented label called tunnelitis instead. The medical mechanism explains the deaths, but one household reveals what those clinical words meant to a family. At Gamoka, West Virginia, Mrs. Charles Jones lived with 3 sons and a husband who all worked inside the tunnel. Her sons were Shirley, Owen, and Cecil, and the congressional record placed all 3 beside their father underground. Before Hawks Nest, the father, Cecil, and Owen endured unstable coal jobs. The new tunnel promised steadier wages. Their shared employment opens a deeper question. How could one tunnel erase the future of an entire working family? Mrs. Jones noticed heavy sediment left in the basin after washing the clothing her family wore inside Gauley Mountain. In September 1931, Shirley came home from the tunnel and told his mother he was awful short-winded. His mother gathered money for an X-ray when obtaining a clear medical explanation proved difficult for the family. Shirley died in June 1932, months after the breathlessness recorded in congressional testimony began. Congress later heard that Shirley requested an examination after death to determine whether tunnel work had killed him. Within 13 months of Shirley's death, his brothers Cecil and Owen had also died after working at Hawk's Nest. The Jones family's legal fight became an early path for exposing silicosis and conditions inside Gauley Mountain. Their case carried the dust into court, where work histories and employer knowledge could no longer remain private. 3 sons from one household transformed white dust from an industrial statistic into a traceable pattern of death. Yet the Jones names survived in court records, while other sick migrants departed without leaving comparable evidence. Men unable to work often left the camps, carrying damaged lungs toward families scattered beyond West Virginia. When migrants died elsewhere, their deaths could escape lists limited to Hawk's Nest workers within the region. Some death certificates recorded pneumonia or heart conditions, rather than connecting the final illness to silica dust. The term tunnelitis further separated symptoms from the occupational disease that congressional witnesses described. A witness told Congress that an undertaker handling numerous burials had testified that his records were destroyed. Black workers who died near Hawk's Nest had few local burial options, leaving grieving families with little choice. A funeral parlor used an open field on the Martha White farm near Summersville to bury African American victims. The graves lacked durable identification, leaving rows of soft earth where permanent names should have marked the dead. When a highway later crossed the area, remains from several graves were moved to another location in West Virginia. Each move widened the distance between a worker's identity, his death certificate, and the tunnel that exposed him. Union Carbide's lists covered deaths recorded in West Virginia, not every worker who fell sick after leaving the site. The missing names explain why no honest account can reduce Hawk's Nest to one unquestioned total of confirmed deaths. Families could establish a pattern, but only litigation offered a chance to force the companies into a public record. The first major Hawk's Nest trials began in 1933, after workers and families brought claims in court. The Jones case established that silicosis victims could sue when the disease was excluded from workers' compensation. Eventually, 538 lawsuits targeted Reinhardt and Dennis and the New Kanawha Power Company. Together, the claims sought millions of dollars, attempting to place a financial value on illness, disability, and death. The largest trial ended with a hung jury, leaving the central accusations exposed, but without a decisive verdict. An eventual out-of-court settlement totaled $200,000 across the large body of Hawk's Nest claims. Recorded individual awards ranged from $30 to $1,600, even when families had lost workers. Those payments resolved claims on paper, but they did not produce accountability proportionate to the death toll. Reinhardt and Dennis disputed negligence, while the corporate structure separated excavation from Union Carbide. Union Carbide likewise defended its position through data, reports, and arguments challenging the workers' allegations. The courts recorded illness and unsafe conditions, but settlements closed claims without deciding the full death count. Court evidence had made the white dust visible, but the nation still lacked an official account of how many had died. That unresolved count moved from West Virginia courtrooms to a federal hearing in Washington during 1936. On January 16, 1936, a House Labor Subcommittee opened hearings into the Hawk's Nest conditions. The inquiry continued across multiple days in January and February, placing workers and other witnesses on the record. Workers described dust, failing breath, disputed diagnoses, vanished co-workers, and graves without lasting names. Proceedings connected to the congressional investigation cited 476 deaths among tunnel workers. That figure was not a final census, because the same inquiry documented why migrant deaths were so difficult to trace. The committee condemned grave disregard for the workers' health, lives, and futures during construction of the tunnel. Federal testimony transformed private suffering into evidence that could no longer be confined to Gauley Bridge. On March 10, 1936, Union Carbide issued a detailed accident and mortality report on the workforce. The report organized company data into a defense against claims made by victims, witnesses, and their representatives. Neither Union Carbide nor Reinhardt and Dennis appeared in person, though written corporate responses entered the record. Congress preserved the evidence, but the hearings produced no public reckoning equal to hundreds of disputed deaths. If the record reached Washington and national newspapers, why did Hawks Nest still recede from American memory? Hawks Nest was never completely secret because the catastrophe received national attention during 1936. A national news magazine reported the tunnel deaths on January 25th, years after construction had begun. The coverage lasted only weeks, while the uncertain toll and scattered survivors resisted one simple closing headline. By 1936, the public had records strong enough to prove disaster, but too incomplete to settle its scale. Competing totals made the disaster easier to dispute, even though every major estimate still described mass death. Most victims were black migrant laborers with little political power and no single community preserving every name. Families dispersed across several states could not maintain one complete archive of employment, illness, and burial. Poorly marked graves made that inequality physical, allowing workers to disappear from both landscapes and records. A documentary poem cycle titled The Book of the Dead publicly preserved Hawks Nest testimony in 1938. The tunnel remained visible as infrastructure, while its workers survived mainly inside archives few readers opened. No single act erased Hawks Nest. Fragmented records, corporate defense, racism, and time gradually narrowed its memory. Enough remained to reopen the count: death certificates, testimony, company reports, graves, and family records. An archive preserves Eugene Abraham and James Brown, both listed at the White Farm burial site near Summersville. The congressional transcript preserves witness accounts that later summaries could compare against corporate claims. Union Carbide's own mortality report provides names and dates, even while presenting arguments for corporate innocence. A major 1986 epidemiological reconstruction estimated as many as 764 deaths. The National Park Service now cites at least 764 workers killed by silicosis at Hawks Nest. In 2002, a federal occupational health publication said more than 1,000 workers were believed dead. Those totals differ because each study defines its workers, time limits, diagnoses, and surviving records differently. None can recover every migrant who left Gauley Mountain sick and died without an occupational diagnosis elsewhere. The precise count remains unknowable, but the verified evidence supports the title's careful word: hundreds were killed. With the number clarified, only the central question remains: what killed them, and what buried that truth afterward? Core samples revealed silica before drilling, so the lethal mineral exposure was a foreseeable construction hazard. Dry drilling, poor ventilation, and limited protection concentrated that silica until acute silicosis scarred lungs. The civil engineering classification withheld even the limited mine safety enforcement then available in West Virginia. Racism and migrant dispersal then weakened the records, while disputed diagnoses and corporate defense blurred the toll. The tunnel kept producing power, but incomplete graves and records denied its victims one definitive human ledger. If these workers deserve more than a disputed number, subscribe to What History Buried and carry their names forward. The new river still enters Gauley Mountain. Its water emerges, but the complete list of dead workers never does. Silica dust from dry drilling killed Hawks Nest workers. Racism, disputed diagnoses, and lost records hid their deaths.